Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Inez Stepman. Inez is a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute, a senior contributor at the Federalist, a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, and the host of the podcast High Noon. A great person all around to get to talk to on this show. Inez, thank you so much for joining me on the Veritas podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to speak to you, Inez. I have to say, I was a fan as soon as I saw certainly your Twitter bio. Twitter bios are usually a place that are reserved for, as we know, maybe gender pronouns or maybe a Black Lives Matter fist emoji, something like that. But in your case, I saw you're an American, you're a champagne capitalist, and you're an anti-feminist, which is something that people don't usually put in their Twitter bio, to say the least. And I do want to talk about feminism a little bit today, even though I always make jokes about the sort of identity politics stock market. And I feel like feminism was sold off a little while ago and hasn't been talked about as much, but it'll be back at some point. I want to ask you, having that in your Twitter bio, anti-feminist, being self-described, is that something that you would consider to be sort of a part of being a conservative, almost a prerequisite to being a conservative? Or do you think it's a more sort of separate part of your worldview?
I certainly think it's linked to conservatism. I would say that it's actually rarer than you would think, even on the right, or at least the establishment and professionalized right. I think a lot of conservatives want to take the position that feminism, at least the initial waves of feminism, were good, but that now the pendulum has swung too far, and that we've gone crazy, right? Like that the modern feminist left has abandoned even the biological distinctions between men and women, and they want to make men and women entirely interchangeable, and that this is somehow very different from earlier waves of feminism. And there's some legitimacy to that view, I think. Certainly there have been feminists, even somebody like Betty Friedan, who really brought the feminist movement to America. She certainly, I think, had some regrets towards the end of her life about where the movement had gone. And there have definitely been people who've gotten off the train at different stops. So it's not that if one, for example, thinks that Simone de Beauvoir has some interesting things to say about men and women, that you automatically have to end up where we are today. I'm not a big fan of sort of inevitability, but I do think that there is a fundamental connection between a movement that on its face, and even in its most basic and earliest iterations, argues that sex is fundamentally, or how we experience sex, and that here I'm talking about the biological sex, not the act of intercourse, but the way that we experience our sex is fundamentally constructed or somehow created by the way we were raised, by society, by the quote unquote patriarchy, right? I think that the reason I call myself an anti-feminist is I fundamentally disagree with that notion. So the definition I always like to point to for feminism, and the one that I think almost everybody on the left and the right who calls themselves a feminist would agree with, and I think it's a really sort of basic and easy definition that doesn't get into all of the inter-feminist, sort of infighting and different views on, for example, sex negative, sex positive, all that stuff. It's very simple. It was in Merriam-Webster as early as the 1870s, and that's the social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. And that has the imprimatur, as I said, of Merriam-Webster going back decades and decades, but it also has the social media and the pop culture imprimatur, because it's also the definition that Beyonce flashes behind her when she does that song that includes some feminist texts and so on. So I think that's a pretty unobjectionable definition across the board. And I guess I'm the only one in my immediate milieu that finds it on its face a bit absurd. I don't think that the equality, the political, social, and economic equality between men and women is either possible or desirable. I think there is a natural equality of all persons, regardless of sex, and that leads to certain protections of certain rights for both men and women. But I think that the notion of that type of equality between men and women that doesn't, for example, assume that men and women will make different economic decisions, they'll make different career decisions, and we should expect them to make those different career decisions, especially in a free society, or that that our social lives should be and the way we interact with the society around us should not be influenced at all by our sex. I find that to be both impossible and undesirable, and that our politics and how we think about those things which we have to make, or those decisions that we have to make together as citizens in a polity, that our sex, so something so fundamental as our sex, would not impact our politics. I think that's kind of crazy, and that idea runs through all waves of feminism, and that's why I think if conservatives thought about it a little more, read a little more Friedan, a little more Simone de Beauvoir, they might come to the conclusion that in fact there is an incompatibility between conservatism and between any kind of feminism, and that doesn't mean that, for example, I don't believe in, as I said, that women have natural rights and have constitutional rights as well in our American system. Obviously our right to speech is just as protected as yours. I think that's a good thing, but I just think that this fundamental idea of the interchangeability of the sexes has been incredibly destructive. It's made relationships between men and women harder. It's made and more sort of opaque and difficult to understand. I think it's brought us a lot of misery, and I think it's also brought us this political construct that's so damaging, where we start off from the assumption that because men and women are quote unquote equal, we go into it with the background assumption that there should be 50-50 in everything, right? We should have an equal number of female astronauts and male astronauts. And then conservatives have to do all this defensive sort of statistical analysis to show why we don't have that equal world. And I would rather just go back to the beginning and assert that, equality between men and women is going to look something very, very different than what we think of now, or what the early feminists thought of.
Yeah, I think the definition of feminism that you're working with is a good one, and I think that your response to it is very thorough, and it's something that isn't said enough, which is essentially that if you have your worldview and the goggles you put on when you look at the world, saying that you have to be seeking equality between the sexes at all times, you sort of end up either implying or eventually dictating explicitly that the sexes are not different. And that is something that it almost immediately in Western society led to problems and led to a lot of friction. And these days, what we've actually seen is the idea of sex at all, biological sex, began to break down. I've been very fascinated by the friction between the transgender movement and all of the gender stuff there and the feminist movement, because there seemed to be a lot of surprise among some feminists when all of a sudden the sex categories and the gender roles themselves are being broken down completely. But ultimately, that seems like a natural consequence to some extent of saying, oh, we have to be seeking equality, because again, seeking complete and total equality, especially equality of outcome, sort of implies that two things are exactly the same, as you were sort of saying.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I work with a lot of what one might call turfy feminist groups, because I do work on issues like the Equality Act. I do work on issues like the ERA and those issues that affect issues of gender identity and for example, female privacy, female safety in a world where self-identification has replaced biological sex, sometimes even legally, as a category. So I have a lot of fantastic turfy type allies, but every time I'm called a turf, I say the F is wrong, right? I don't dispute the T part. I'm disputing the F part. I'm no kind of feminist, including a trans exclusionary radical feminist. But I have these feminist allies, but I've had some of these discussions with them, these debates with them, because I think you're right. I think one, we want to draw this very sharp line in terms of the biological distinctions between those that are sort of more obvious and less obvious, right? So I think there are a lot of people who, when one says that males and females are interchangeable to the point where a woman can have a penis, right? I think people that a lot more people are like, well, okay, that's obviously biologically not true. But we think less about all of the other biological differences between men and women that have results that conflict with feminist goals even prior to this moment that we're in, where we are denying even the most obvious and external biological differences between men and women. Men's and women's brains are different, right? There's a study that came out in 2017 that if you're looking at brain scans of fetuses in the womb, with 90 something percent accuracy from just a brain scan, you can tell whether that's a male or female baby. So those brain development differences start before we're even born. And there are all kinds of sort of, in some mostly irrelevant differences, right? Like, for example, men have better binocular vision, women have better peripheral vision. So it actually, interestingly, makes women very good fighter pilots. A very small percentage of women who are interested in pursuing that kind of work and have sort of the guts and for that kind of work. They're actually quite good at because they see things more in the periphery than men do, and that makes their response time quicker. I mean, but these are biological differences. But those neurological differences then translate into overwhelmingly psychological differences, right? And these are the things that a lot of feminists do not want to think about. They have, at least the TERF side of feminism has no problem saying, a man with a penis shouldn't be in a woman's locker room, shouldn't be in a woman's prison. Women are physically vulnerable. Like, an MMA fighter should not enter the ring. A male MMA fighter, biologically male, should not enter the ring and then crack the skull of a female MMA fighter, which is a real case, right? That happened. Yep. They're very willing to say that, but they're less willing to consider, for example, the fact that brain and neurological differences might make women more relational. That might make women more likely to find fulfillment in certain types of careers, or even in no career at all, and becoming homemakers than men are. They're not willing to consider that those might actually be implications of biological differences, in the same way that having broader shoulders and more upper body strength makes men better athletes, right? In almost overwhelmingly all cases, right? 99.9% of cases. And they're very willing to consider that because it's more obvious and it's hard to deny. But we actually do have the science now that shows that those differences are more than skin deep. They are about more than what our gonads look like. They are really, really profound and interesting. And I find them fascinating. I think it's really liberating to discover sort of all of these both large and small ways in which we have developed as male and female of the species to have these complementary assets. But I think it's very difficult for feminists to talk about that because it undermines their social project. And two, I think it's really hard to talk about in a general sense because people now are so allergic to talking or making observations about generalities. That they're sort of exception obsessed, right? We have built an entire world, especially in regard to gender relations, I think, or sex differences. We've built a world around exceptions, and it's not that I deny that those exceptions exist. In some cases, I am one of the exceptions. On some things, I'm not, right? But on spatial reasoning, for example, I have much better spatial reasoning than I do have relational or associative reasoning. Women can remember the relationships of different objects in a room much longer, and men can remember things on a list. Like my brain works on the list basis, and not so much on the relational basis. That makes me an exception in this certain way, right? And every generality that you observe about the differences of men and women is going to have exceptions on both ends. You're going to have men that have more female or feminine attributes. You're going to have women who have more masculine attributes. But it seems like we're almost allergic or unable to have this conversation in a nuanced way that acknowledges that, yes, the general statements I'm making will not apply to every single man and every single woman, but they do apply with regard to medians. They do apply, with regard to the mean, and in many cases they apply to more people than not, right? And we just have an entire discourse focused around a small minority of exceptions as though they disprove the rule.
Yeah, and what's important about that is that a society cannot stand at all governing for the tiny, tiny, tiny minority, for the exception, and ignoring the overwhelming majority. Because some of the scientific, and these are scientific differences between men and women that you're describing, they're biological, physiological, psychological. Some of these are so profound that you'd get something like 99.9% accuracy predicting them in one sex or the other. I mean, some of these things are, as you said, quite profound. And what there's been lately that I think you were sort of describing is there's sort of a war on noticing. There's a war on pattern recognition, and there's a war on generalities, because there is the universal employment of the ultimate straw man argument, which is to always say, well, here's an exception. And now we have to make sure that we focus a lot on this exception to the rule and ignore the generality, because that goes against this exception. And ultimately that feeds into usually a narrative. So for instance, with feminism, there is a concerted effort, especially when feminism sort of reaches itself into the pop culture realm, to portray that women are just as strong and brave, they're just as combat effective as men. And that if you were to point out that actually in a like physical combat scenario, say in the middle of, I know we're out of Afghanistan, but wherever we're fighting in a war, that men are probably going to have an easier time, especially in close quarters combat. What's going to get immediately thrown at you is, oh, well, actually, I know a really big, tough woman that could probably beat up this very scrawny little guy, which of course is a logical fallacy. So we kind of end up in this space where we're constantly being forced to give up on these generalities because they go against this narrative, when in reality, these generalities come from science. They're some of the most useful information we have to try and govern and build a society around the fact that, yes, there are men and there are women, and we want them both to be able to live fulfilling lives. But really, if we want them to be able to do that, we have to actually pay attention to the differences between them, not brush them under the rug just because they're ultimately, I think what it comes down to is it's uncomfortable. It makes a lot of people feel bad to say, oh, well, men might be better at this, women might be better at this. But the reality is, yes, men and women are different, and they're better and worse at different things. It's scientific fact.
Yeah, I think there's two points I'd like to make in response to that. The first is that we really have constructed a world, I think, that is catering to at most the 20% of women who are exceptions in a variety of ways, and really ignoring the needs of the 80%. I think we're increasingly going to have, as evidence, especially as my generation of millennials, hits 40, 45, and confronts the sort of consequences of the decision making that has been the default in our society, and the sort of social script that we've pushed. I think what you're going to see is probably a lot of regret and a lot of post hoc rationalization, because honestly, there are a lot of women who, particularly when you get out of a small handful of careers that are really, that one really can wrap oneself into, right? And of course, you can say even that may not be fulfilling at a certain point. But the reality is the majority of women don't have quote unquote careers. They have jobs. They need to have jobs to put food on the table. But we have this social script that tells women to put off marriage, to put off family for their quote unquote careers, and to see that as a source of fulfillment and self-actualization and all those like sort of 70s buzzwords that I hate. But and the reality is that we're actually ignoring what probably makes the 80% of women feel more fulfilled, which is not only and exclusively babies and family and having a husband, but generally interpersonal relationships and community. Like women, it is on average more important to women and their happiness. There are a lot more men who are happier in a job that requires, focus on a computer for 12 hours a day in their own cubicle. And there are a lot fewer women who are happy with that kind of lifestyle because it doesn't include enough interactive or interpersonal relationships, which, by the way, if we actually wanted, I don't think it's a goal that is worthwhile to increase the number of women in STEM or like, I don't think that that's an important goal to have. But if in fact it was your goal, I think probably the suggestion that the much maligned James Damore memo made about how to draw more women into STEM would probably work a lot better than these quotas and these, sort of top-down, heavy-handed, sort of social justice-y style mandates. If you really want more women in STEM, make it more interpersonal. Make it so that you are talking to a lot of people, and taking breaks from having, this very sort of lonely, from a lot of women's perspective, life of a computer programmer. If you want more female computer programmers, make it more interpersonal. And he kind of threw out a few ways where that might be possible. Obviously, there's some aspects of computer programming that just do not lend themselves to an interpersonal job, but he had some of those suggestions. Like, that is the sort of productive thinking that our society needs to engage in, that actually accepts the reality of sex differences, and then asks, what kind of society are we going to build that's actually going to make both men and women more fulfilled in who they are, rather than to try to fight nature itself in the vast majority of cases. But the other point that I wanted to make is actually about the exceptions. And this is much less about like something that we just said about, you know, computer programming or whatever else. But I think generally, you know, counterculture is itself seems like a sort of figment of the imagination, I think, to a lot of people, maybe your age or younger, in the sense that we see all this revival of a lot of the counterculture stuff from the 90s, from the 80s, even from like the 70s, 60s, right? The idea of having these subcultures that are totally at odds with the dominant culture and are essentially communities of weirdos in some way, that challenge some kind of dominant paradigm in the culture. Well, we now live in a world where everybody's weirdness not only has to be allowed, it has to be celebrated and mainstreamed. And I think that that's really damaging to the kind of communities that do spring up for exceptions, that do spring up for weirdos, that do, and I'm not using it pejoratively, right? But do create some of the most interesting communities, the most interesting art, you know, the most interesting, like, and sort of erotic spaces or whatever you want to call it. You lose the power of those spaces when you mainstream them. They become corporatized, they become bland, they become part of a Delta ad, right? Which is what we've seen. And I think there's a lot of debate within the gay community about that, actually. Like, we've seen happen with Pride, right? Where it's gone from being something that was completely stigmatized and in fact, you know, outlawed, and people could get arrested, right, for participating. But there is some discontent with the way that it's not obviously not discontent with the fact that they're not getting arrested anymore, but discontent with the fact that now every Pride parade has to be like, it's a bunch of corporate floats. It's very sort of standardized and bland. And it's you know, it's losing some of the edge that perhaps some older members of the community remember. And I think that that's kind of happening across the board. I think part of the way, if you force everything to be standardized and mainstreamed, and you make essentially the exception the rule all the time, you also lose those interesting spaces for exceptions that can be fonts of great art, it can be fonts of great community. I think you actually sort of, it's kind of like, you know, the famous wall of separation between church and state that Jefferson wrote about in his letters, which is not in the Constitution, which a lot of people think it is. But he wrote eloquently about the fact that there should be a wall of separation on both sides, that he was worried the government would corrupt the church and that church would corrupt politics. I kind of feel the same way about these kinds of culture versus counterculture. It's not only that you corrupt the culture by mainstreaming things that once happened behind closed doors or between like an exclusive community of people who were just a little bit odd in this way. You also ruin the beauty of a lot of the things themselves when you mainstream them, when you put them on, you know, MTV. I think one of the great Folly essays is about why she loves Madonna's one of Madonna's music videos that was pornographic or borderline pornographic, but why it shouldn't have been on MTV, right? That it should have been relegated to this exclusive space where things like that really could thrive and maintain their eroticism in a way that it would not maintain its eroticism, as she noted later, as the evolution of like from Madonna to Lady Gaga, where you lose even anything interesting about that kind of eroticism or that kind of performance because it has to be mainstreamed. And so I think both sides infect the other. I think our inability to hold things a little bit in tension and to say that we might have like a dominant social life script that might work for the majority of women, but still, you know, acknowledge that there are exceptions to that for both women and men. I think that inability to hold those two things in tension, I think is very damaging to our society. And I think not only does it make a lot of women, you know, regret a lot of their life choices, I think, as they get older, but it also kind of destroys the fun of the flip side of being the exception as well. And I think it's just generally a blander, more boring, and more miserable world.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is very interesting. And it seems to me it's not just applicable as it pertains to feminism, but to sort of the broader woke orthodoxy. I sort of think of feminism as being one arm of this big, nobody knows exactly what to call it. So I've taken to calling it the woke orthodoxy because people recognize the word woke. And what it does is, like you're kind of saying, it has this fascinating ability to take the spaces that are supposed to be kind of safe and sort of majority, ruled by the normal majority, if you will. These, you imagine maybe your kind of idyllic middle class suburban family, and it injects a lot of weird, obscure academic theory into those spaces, to the point where you now have, suburban moms talking about, white privilege and critical race theory and all of these things that they didn't even know what those were a year ago. And then, like you're saying, they take the spaces where a lot of weird and avant-garde ideas are celebrated and are incubated, and they actually they sort of bring them into the same space that they're bringing the other spaces, which is this monoculture that they're sort of mandating. And what I mean by that is, you take a community like the gay community, which is known for being a place for unique people that are outliers. That was kind of their whole thing, is this: a lot of these people are living their life on the fringes. They were pushed down to the bottom for a long time. But now, if you look at it, just like with everything else woke, the gay, kind of the gay commentariat always seems to go in the same direction. Like, if you read The Advocate, you're not really reading a gay publication, you're reading a woke publication, is a good way of, I think, kind of exemplifying what I'm saying. And you see the same thing with any community, whether it's like the atheist community. If you go to an atheist convention or you read an atheist blog at this point, you're much more likely to find it to be very woke and to sort of have the same buzzwords there than to actually be focused on atheism. Because there's this state mandated monoculture that the woke orthodoxy seems to want to accomplish. And while it's doing that, it takes the roles of these two spaces, one for kind of the underground or the unique and the counterculture, and one for the mainstream, and it reverses them onto each other, because it kind of just wants everything to be the same and to push this same message.
It is very puritanical in a certain sense. And I'm not breaking any new ground here. Lots of people, from John McWhorter to a whole host of more dissident voices, have described this as a religion or as a replacement for religion. And I don't think it's an accident that wokeism, for lack of a better word, has become so popular after the rise of postmodernism in the academy. And I should say something more specific: after postmodernism became the default mode of analysis in the academy. I think there was a craving for something normative, for something declarative, for something that allowed for the kind of righteous fervor that one feels when one knows something to be true, in like a deep sense, right? And people wanted a cause, a purpose, a meaning, something that had some sort of grip to it. That wasn't, and so it's a very bizarre manifestation of that impulse. But I guess I understand the impulse, especially after our institutions and academy were so steeped in postmodernism that people had nothing to grab onto, and at the same time, of course, you have the mass secularization going on. Now, some people on the right dispute that there is a mass secularization going on. I tend to think that there in fact is. The counter argument is that, in fact, there's a lot more secular people than we thought there were before. What's happening is people are falling away from the church, people who were going out of obligation but weren't really dedicated to it. Well, that, first of all, even if that's the case, it has massive societal consequences, as Tim Carney has written extensively on in his book Alienated America. But I tend to think, just sort of anecdotally and observationally, I tend to think that, yes, we are experiencing a rise in secularization. And I think that's left very little for people to grab onto. But, that's not going to make it any less dangerous. Understanding it is not going to make it any less dangerous. I do think that sometimes we make a mistake, essentially debating the finer points of critical race theory, for example, and then what did what did the founders of critical race theory actually think it was? Was it a legal theory? Was it, meant to, I would argue that there is a very good argument that they meant it to leave the boundaries of law school. And now it's sort of disingenuous to say that critical race theory is some kind of niche little theory that you won't encounter until you go to law school. I think the principles very clearly have metastasized into the K-12 system, among other places. But I'm not sure that debate is even that productive, in the sense that it's the impulse underneath it that is important, and the consequences and the practical, ideas and projects and, sort of constructs that children will encounter in K-12 education that matter. And I'm not sure that it matters whether it's critical race theory or it's just something, a fellow traveler of critical race theory in terms of the underlying principles involved. But I think maybe it doesn't really make sense to debate the finer points in the same way that it doesn't really make sense to debate the finer points of, like, no atheist has ever convinced a believer. And there are a fair number of atheists in this category, right, who like aggressively read the Bible and try to memorize, a bunch of Bible verses. And then when they talk to somebody who is a Christian or a Jew or a religious believer, and they'll say, well, what about this verse versus that verse? I just don't think that's a very effective mode of argument when somebody has these underlying commitments. And I think that's essentially the situation in which we find ourselves with a certain portion of the left, the woke left. I don't think that they will be convinced that if you can cite sort of chapter and verse of their religion, that they're going to be convinced out of their underlying principles, or that those underlying principles need to be imposed on the entirety of society.
Yeah, this is a very, very important point. I can't say how strongly I agree with you, because one thing that I'm always thinking about is how we fight back against some of the most aggressive and some of the most damaging and corrosive ideas, whether it's feminism or some of the Black Lives Matter and critical race theory stuff. And I do think that picking it apart sort of academically implies that it's a sort of a logical creature and that you can beat it with logic, when it's really, really not. It's very much something that I think is designed to do damage to society, frankly. I mean, if you break it down and you look at the way it's, certainly, I think that if you really want to understand these things, you have to look at the way they're being applied. And if you look at the way these things are being applied in practice, they need to be addressed as a strategy, as a set of tactics, not so much as a set of ideas. Because as you said, if you approach them as ideas, you try to pick apart the ideas, it's not going to convince anyone. So one thing that I like to ask people about when it comes to these ideologies is the fact that one of their strongest tactics, and one of the things that I think has been a big reason why we've seen them gain so much ground in recent years, these sort of woke ideas, including feminism, is that they have a really interesting ability, and the people who are spreading them have a really innate and amazing ability to trick people into thinking that these ideas are actually heterodox, that they are signifiers of independent thought and rebellion. And this is a particularly effective strategy, as everyone knows, among young people. And it seems for some reason, especially young college-educated people, and especially young college-educated women, is that I think that a lot of young people, they wear feminism or Black Lives Matter as a sort of badge of, look how rebellious and countercultural and anti-traditional I am, and heterodox, even though the thing that's so fascinating about this from a sort of a strategic standpoint in the culture war is that all it signals is that these people have sort of been, it signals obedience. It signals the fact that they've taken these ideas that have been forced onto them and sort of uncritically looked at them. Because if you break down the reality behind the main thing that has brought, say, Black Lives Matter into the mainstream, which is the supposed slaughter of Black people by the police, the numbers are not, the mathematical reality of that issue isn't at all what it's been portrayed as. That's evident to somebody who takes a 5-minute look at it. Same thing with a lot of the feminist issues, including the wage gap. So I want to ask you, Inez, how do you think it is, because this always kind of escapes me, how do you think it is that whether it's the feminists or the critical race theorists, how do they get so many people, especially young people, to sort of buy into the ideology on the basis that, oh, this is the sort of scrappy rebel thing to do, and I'll be going up against the evil regime, when in reality, it's kind of reversed. The scrappy rebel thing is what the anti-feminists are doing. I mean, we're the ones getting kicked off Twitter, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult to describe anything about this woke ideology as outside the institutions of power, right? They are constantly talking about the analysis of power to the exclusion of all kinds of other fascinating things that motivate individuals to do what they end up doing. They're sort of obsessed with this lens of power, and somehow completely unwilling to train that lens back on themselves, which I guess is not surprising given human nature, but it is. So this most recent incident between there was a young white woman and then a black man and walking his dog with his fiance, and there was that altercation, and she yelled at them to go back to their hood. That's where the video started filming, and then she ended up being fired from her job. It struck me very obviously in that situation a couple things, that even if, and there are serious doubts as to whether he was actually being truthful about how this incident went down to begin with, but even as told by the man, the attempted canceller, right, or I guess successful canceller, he was exactly backwards about who has the power in that kind of situation. Let's say that she was screaming something racist at him on the street. That did not actually have any institutional backing. There is no institution, contrary to, the claims of critical race theory. And I think here they're exactly wrong. There is no institutional backing for racism in America. There was once. There isn't anymore. In fact, all these institutions, whether public or private, are doing everything they can to bend over backwards in order to recruit and bring in people of color and women, right? And so the analysis of who actually has power in that situation is, of course, that the guy who's trying to cancel and then got this woman fired within 24 hours, he's the one who has the power in society. He is the one who has that institutional backing. He is the one who has the support of not only her boss immediately, right, but then of all of the mainstream media, right? His narrative is the one that is taken and framed, despite all of the sort of worrying caveats about where he might have not been telling the truth. There is no interest in investigating her story, because that is not what the institutions of this country, that narrative, her narrative, is not what the institutions of the country are interested in upholding. It seems very obvious to me who has the power here, and not just in terms of like democratic power, which I'm not sure that they actually have, and there seems to be a backlash building, but institutional power, right? There is no, whether it's the boardrooms of America's corporations, whether it's the newsrooms and the media rooms that pump out the way that people inform themselves about the world, whether it's the tech companies that, as you say, are silencing dissenting voices both on the right and the wrong kind of left, right? Whether it is the agencies, bureaucratic agencies in government that are pumping out regulations and guidance and so-called dear colleague letters, right, in 1,000 different ways to support, to send grants to support a bunch of these sort of, one might call them woke causes, right? They have a direct, in many cases, they're being funded directly by the federal government, these kind of nonprofit activist agencies. And schools, Joe Biden advanced the rule. Now there was such pushback that they actually have to take more time to answer, because in terms of under the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, they have to answer all of the letters that were or the objections that were raised to this proposed rule. But they did advance a proposed rule to start writing grants to schools to teach Ibram Kendi. Like, that's one of the examples that they bring up in the explanation of the text of the rule. So it is enormously difficult, to your point, to make the case that if the federal government is backing you with money, the biggest newsrooms of America are favorably covering your story, your perspective, your narrative, your politics. The major corporations of America and the boardrooms of America are all in lockstep, releasing statements in support, and in fact implementing, racial trainings and so on, in accordance with that ideology. I mean, it is really, really difficult then to try to frame yourself as the upstart. The reality is that they've won institutionally, and there's only a question of where we go from here and what to do about the millions and millions, and perhaps majority of Americans who in some way or another object to this ideology. They're the ones who don't have any mainstream representation. They're the ones whose views are not advanced, largely through policies of government. They're the ones who are worried about losing their jobs in mainstream corporate America if they say the wrong thing, or they tweet the wrong thing. They're the ones who are worried about losing access to not only social media, but now it's jumped into IRL, right? Like, we're starting to see some of the more fringe figures get deplatformed, not from social media, but lose their bank accounts, lose their ability to contract, for example, to get a ride, right? Very quickly, you can see the beginnings of a social credit system, a totally private social credit system developing. I think it's ridiculous. It's always been, I think that's like a hangover from the 60s, every wave of the left thinks of themselves as, these fighting the man, when it's beyond obvious that certainly now, if not even 20 or 30 years ago, these people have taken the reins of power in virtually every institution in the United States, and they're not fighting the man, they are the man.
Yeah, I think that's so well said and speaks exactly what I was trying to get at, which is that it's one of their strongest assets. And I think it's such a big reason why they've taken so much ground in recent years. How do you think, Inez, if there is, and it's not clear to me that there is, I wonder about this a lot, sort of what exactly the score is and what % of people really understand how awful this all is. But let's say that there is a silent majority. How do you think we break through the propaganda and the sort of cancel culture, oppression of dissent? What do you think it would look like if in the near future there was a real backlash? Because people are always saying, oh, the backlash is coming, the backlash is coming. We've had people saying that for 10 years now, and it just never quite seems to. I mean, Trump winning in 2016 kind of sort of felt like it for a minute there, but of course that didn't work out in the long run. What do you think it's going to look like if it happens at all, when people finally do say enough is enough?
I do think we're reaching a tipping point. I think the institutionalization of this ideology makes it really, really hard for people to think that it's, sorry if you can hear my dog snoring, but it's making it really, really difficult for people to imagine that this is just a few sort of college professors and radical students who will quote unquote hit the real world, right? And that was the conservative line for a very long time, and it was completely foolish, right? You cannot graduate rank after rank of essentially the nation's managerial elite with this ideology, indoctrinated with this ideology, and expect that it won't transform the world. So what happened is, on impact of the world is giving, right, instead of the students. And so I think what it's going to take for this, I think there is a backlash. I think that the question you're really asking is, how do we make sure that this backlash is actually effective? And actually, has the effect of pushing back or pushing out some of these people from positions of power, and restoring at least some kind of marketplace of ideas that in which people don't feel the regard. In the latest survey, 65% of Americans feel the need to self-censor their political views, right? That seems, in a democracy, that seems not only, first of all, the silence majority, but second of all, I mean, we're very quickly going to turn into an ersatz democracy if that's the case, right? The purpose of the First Amendment is, in fact, not to protect, pornography, although it does that incidentally, or whatever else. It is to make sure that we as citizens can have an open discussion when we have to make these decisions for the country. And it's what we have right now is a democracy in name only, in the sense that there's very tight boundaries on what kind of political ideas and policies are allowed to be discussed at all. And that, I mean, we can lose our democracy in spirit long before we lose it in sort of actuality of going to the voting booth if everybody you vote for has essentially the same opinion. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I do think, you know, the longer this institutional control goes on, the closer that's going to look like what our situation is going to look like. In terms of how to be effective, I think this is largely a critique of the conservative movement and of Republican Party, right? The Republican Party for the last 30 years, at least since Reagan, has more or less accomplished tax cuts. And tax cuts are very nice. It's nice to keep more of your own money, but it will not help you when you're hurtling off a cliff culturally. And they have ceded virtually every social battle to the left because they simply don't focus, or at least didn't until recently, focus on the culture war that was always considered within the establishment of the Republican Party and within even the establishment of the conservative movement. It was always considered kind of the redheaded stepchild of the conservative movement were the social conservatives, right? They weren't hip. They were, you know, whatever. They were, you know, too religious. They weren't going to appeal to a broad selection of the public. That was sort of the consultant line about what was going to win elections for Republicans, right? It was going to be, we're going to be the reasonable people who are for fiscal sanity and tax cuts. And that turned out to be suicide, not just for the party, but for the country, to ignore education, to ignore the university system that's pumping out these ideas to begin with, to ignore, you know, the fact that both media and corporations are swinging further and further left. I mean, to ignore these social problems. One, I actually think, to quote myself, which is always fun, the culture war is the big tent. I think that actually the voters are more with Republicans on the culture war issues of, you know, critical race theory in school, gender ideology being advanced, you know, in kindergartens. You know, they are more with us on those issues than they are with us on tax cuts, which tend to be unpopular, right? So, and I'm not saying that makes them a worse policy, but that's just the reality. That this idea that fiscally conservative and socially liberal is the way to build a party in the United States electorate, I think is just not true. It's the most popular position of people in the media and in like Washington, D.C. and New York, but it's not the popular position to take with the broader electorate. So one, I think they're just wrong that these issues are not something that we should run on and actively, I think. And so I think we're starting to see that at least lip service is being paid in a way that was not the case, you know, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But also it requires smart. I mean, I think we are late enough in the game that it requires real savvy and real competence to execute these kinds of policies. And I work in the sort of ed policy realm, and I can give you a list of things, for example, in K-12 that we should have done a long time ago. And I actually wrote a piece for the Federalist about 5 years ago saying this is nearly our last chance to push the gas on school choice. This is our last chance before the parents making the decisions about where kids are going to school, even in a school choice environment, are going to want them, because they're going to be millennial parents and not Gen X. They're going to want a lot more of this social indoctrination for their children. And I think we are at that tipping point now. But, you know, policies like school choice that have been enormously successful in the last year in the States, they also need to be coupled with a long, hard look at, for example, the accreditation system in the private schools that is oftentimes a source of DEI consultancies and how a lot of these woke ideas creep into even private schools, right? And even religious private schools sometimes. It needs to be coupled with a very serious look at accreditation. We need to look at teacher teacher accreditation as well, and teacher trainings, which are almost all sort of left wing and almost all based around this identity politics, wokeism, whatever. So we need to look at teacher trainings. We need to have these battles in the school districts across America about what our children are actually learning. It turns out that is the most important thing you can do in the political battle, is make sure that the other side doesn't literally take control of the future voters of America. And for some reason, the right has allowed the left to do that, is just to take over the entire education and cultural space, and thought that there were not going to be consequences for that while they were, celebrating getting their third tax cut of the decade. And that is just, that cannot continue. It cannot continue at this late hour. We have to prioritize these cultural issues. We have to prioritize the education system. We have to prioritize, frankly, at this point, I think we need to pull the plug on the universities. They're all dependent. Nearly every university in America, with very few exceptions, is entirely dependent on student loans, on federally backed student loans. The federal government owns 92% of student loans now. So there's virtually no private market for getting a loan to go to university. It continues to astonish me that as of now, as far as I know, we have not a single serious Republican effort to even freeze student loans and the money going out the door for student loans to universities on the basis that they are simply ideological training camps for the enemy. It's political suicide. I don't understand why the Republican Party still hasn't gotten this message. But those are the kinds of policies that we need to start thinking about. We need to start thinking like the left about taking over cultural institutions, and those that we can't gain a foothold in, that are too far gone. We need to think about how we can build alternatives to those institutions and support those alternatives, and build policies that support those alternatives. We have been reluctant to play politics with the culture. And frankly, the culture is an intrinsic part of the political, of what it is to be political. And we need to get over that impulse, I think. But I think we need to be smart about it. Some of the proposals of the new right, occasionally, I look at them as like a policy person, and I think of them as kind of bull in a china shop ideas that have the right impulses. But we need to develop a bench on the right of people who understand what the problem is in America and prioritize cultural issues, but also have that kind of base knowledge and policy expertise that is necessary to actually craft good solutions, as opposed to just feel good about doing something. I think that was a large part of the problem of the Trump administration. There were not enough people to staff a Trump administration that agreed with his goals. And so he had the simultaneous problems of the loyal but wholly incompetent having no idea what they're doing, and also a lot of disloyal people, like a lot of just straight up grifters. And then at the same time, a lot of the people who did have the credentials and the policy expertise and the know-how of how to actually operate an effective administration, those people were either lukewarm about what the policy goals of the Trump administration actually were, or actively undermined them. Because even though they might have had R's next to their name, they were not on board with that agenda. That was a massive problem. I don't think we can repeat that. If we get another shot at this, it has to be more competent, whether it's Trump or someone else. It has to be more competent. It has to be more serious. We have to take on this bureaucracy that has a life and power of its own, that is full of people who cannot be fired, and have no incentive to do their jobs for somebody with whom they politically disagree. I mean, we're not going to get anywhere until we start to tackle those kinds of big problems with the kind of both the passion and clarity, but also the competence. And that is my hope, my sort of last hope, maybe. I don't want to be dramatic, but is that whatever the next Republican administration will be, it will focus on the right things, and it'll execute competently on those things.
Yeah, I love what I'm hearing from you, Inez, because I think that, as you sort of said, it's been a long time coming that people start to take this fight very seriously from a policy standpoint in terms of how do we wield power when we have it, whether you're talking about the right or, I'm someone who's not even necessarily on the right completely, but I'm certainly in a coalition with them standing against all of the woke stuff. So if we look at that coalition, it seems like no one was really taking this fight very seriously and trying to actually do stuff. There were a lot of conversations, which are great, but there wasn't a lot of action. And the thing that's really the shame about that is that, of course, Donald Trump had a completely Republican government for a hot minute there. And like you said, well, we got some tax cuts. So I think that the conversation gets very, very interesting once we start talking about what do we actually do. You know, this is especially exciting when we think about the fact that Joe Biden has a 43% approval rating. And of course, it's going to be a few more years before the next presidential election, but there's perhaps an opportunity. I'm hesitant to ask about a Donald J. Trump because I think the conversation about him gets a little boring and it would probably take the rest of the show to discuss it. So instead, what I want to ask you about is more about what we might actually do if hypothetically there is another opportunity and an entirely Republican government or some kind of coalition between Republicans and classical liberals that has a little bit of power to wield. One thing that I've talked to a lot of people about that I think it makes some conservatives very uncomfortable is because it has to do with regulation on some level of private businesses, is how do we address the core problem of people not being able to state their beliefs without the fear of being fired by their employer? And one thing that I've raised is that we do have in our government currently this idea that you can't fire people explicitly because of their sex, race, religion, et cetera. I've always wondered, why can't we add, and this is what James Damore's whole situation ended up boiling down to, and he was unsuccessful in his attempt to sue Google over his termination. Why don't we have political opinion as a protected class? Or at least, even if that wasn't the solution, do you think the time has come for conservatives, even though it might cause some friction within their own ranks, is it time to look at regulating the ability to fire people for mainstream opinion, specifically that they communicate outside of work?
So it sounds good, but I'm not sure it would be effective for this reason. There are already a lot of states that have political registration or political opinion as a protected class, and conservatives have, including California, by the way, which is where Google is headquartered, right? So I'm not sure how effective that's been in the courts at all. So I'm not sure, but one thing that I do think we have to look at, and perhaps in the other direction, is that our civil rights laws have been flagrantly abused by the left in the last two administrations, in the Obama and now the Joe Biden administration, to essentially push unilaterally social policies for the left very effectively across the entire country, not even through legislation, just through reinterpreting our civil rights law, because our civil rights law is necessarily a huge hammer, right? And it was a massive departure from the normal powers of the federal government, which is why you had, for example, people like Barry Goldwater objecting to this public accommodations provision, even though he was one of the earliest anti-segregation activists and was very much against racial segregation. He said, this is beyond the power of the federal government. Well, that genie's long out of the bottle, right? And maybe for good reason, right? I'm not going to relitigate sort of the contours of the Civil Rights Act, but it is an unusual hammer that was handed to the federal government for a very special purpose, and that was to try to tackle essentially private collusion, cultural collusion with regard to racial discrimination. Because and it's interesting because actually this looks to me much more like what conservatives are experiencing on social media than it does the various ways in which the left wants to use this example. The reason that there was a public accommodations provision, which prevented private businesses, seriously curtailed their right of association, right, and their right to choose who to do business with, saying you cannot choose who you want to do business with on the basis of race, even though you're a private institution. If there's any kind of state action involved, which, calling the police to throw someone out of your establishment they counted that as a state action. You can't do that. This is, and the problem they were confronting was, even if we get rid of the de jure segregation laws on the books in the South, what's happening is that, for example, all of the hotels, and this is what the Green Book was all about, right? All of the hotels in an entire geographic region, even though they weren't sitting there in like an antitrust way and talking to each other and saying, well, we're all going to set the same policies and we're going to make more money that way. Instead, it was essentially a monoculture that said, this is, we only want to serve white customers, even though there's a business interest in serving Black customers as well as white, right? And what you had is like the equivalent, I'm sure that the chains were different at that time, but the equivalent of having, a Best Western and a Marriott Inn and a Holiday Inn without talking to each other, all saying, we are going to make this cultural commitment that we're only going to serve white customers, right? And you had that in a whole geographic region. It seems to me there's something very similar going on with regard to political opinion in the social media context, right? Where it's not that Twitter, on paper, right? These folks are competitors, and in many ways they are competitors, right? But that Twitter and Facebook both end up restricting largely the same set of people and the same set of beliefs. Is that because they're talking to each other in a sort of, antitrust monopolistic kind of way? No, it's because there's a monoculture within those private companies that says these people and their views are icky, and we don't want to have our private resources used in service of those views. So it strikes me that one, even though I'm not sure about the solution of sticking political orientation into a civil rights law context, I do think this is kind of how we should be thinking about the problem, because I think some of the contour problems, while obviously not nearly as bad and sort of reprehensible as what was happening in the Jim Crow South, there is an element of similarity in the problem, where you just have private actors. Because if it was just Facebook that was censoring conservatives, it wouldn't be a problem. They would go to Twitter, or they would go to, we would have a proliferation of social media sites, right, that do go up and down. And we would have the introduction of it, or, of a Parler or but what we have instead is one, the giants are using their platform to drive their competition out of business. And that's what happened with Parler, right? They just yanked them off the hosting, off the App Store, and then off the hosting platform. But two, the reason this is such a big problem is not because you have a right to a Twitter account, right? And I think sometimes the right talks about that in kind of a silly way, and it comes off as silly to people. Like, fundamentally, you don't have a right to a Twitter account, right? But if every way of getting your message out there is foreclosed to you, and of course it happens first to the most sort of undesirable or unsympathetic people, like Stormfront, the Nazi website, right? Not only were they kicked off of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, 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 right? But now their website has been pulled from multiple hosts. They find it very, very difficult to find like somebody to host the website because of the content, which is, again, completely egregious. But, that's the kind of problem that you can eliminate the culture and the value of free speech while maintaining the parchment barrier of the First Amendment. And furthermore, as Vivek Ramaswamy has written, I think, really presciently about, what we're seeing is a collusion between private companies and the government when they share these kinds of cultural goals. So what we're seeing is either senators or other folks in the Biden administration or other folks in government are essentially saying, nod, nod, wink, wink, wouldn't it be great? Like, you have a responsibility to take down, for example, Donald Trump's account. And lo and behold, those corporations are hearing in those hearings from powerful senators, and they're doing it. And that's a kind of collusion between government and private industry that is very worrying and can have consequences far beyond whether or not one has a quote unquote right to a Twitter account, right? So I think you're thinking about it the right way when you think about it in the civil rights context and as a problem that is addressed by that type of legislation. I haven't found yet exactly what sort of my sort of legislative silver bullet, but I do think that essentially this is something that in the next couple of years, the right is going to have to figure out. We're going to have to figure out something that still a lot of people on the right are uncomfortable doing, which is probably going to involve multiple forms of regulation, is probably going to involve some kind of adjustment to the laws. And maybe in the antitrust context, maybe not. Maybe it's going to involve a modification of Section 230. Maybe it's just going to involve yanking all these guys before a bunch of hearings and yelling at them. I don't know what the most effective way, and it's not my sort of field of expertise, but I do think we have to figure it out. And I do think you're right to think of it in that context of sort of civil rights, because I think it's presenting in many ways a similar problem with similar problems in terms of the limitation of what government can and can't do, as was as the problems that the civil rights laws were intended to address.
Yeah, I think that it's certainly one of, if not the biggest questions that faces the conservative movement, the heterodox coalition, the intellectual dark web, whatever you want to call it, for the next few years. Because at the end of the day, there can, not only can there, I mean, if you don't have your sort of moral and social right to free speech, you really don't have free speech, as you were kind of saying. Even if there is that sort of like, oh, well, you're not getting thrown in jail. It's like, big frickin' whoop. If every single meaningful form of communication is closed off to you, you effectively don't have free speech. And if you don't have free speech, you don't have a democracy at the end of the day. So
let me jump in just one thing that you said. I think thus far we've ignored something that is equally as powerful in getting people to shut up as losing their jobs, which is something like that's the one end of what we're going to have to solve. But the other end of it is in some ways both more difficult and more important. People are terrified of this social ostracization that comes with being canceled, right? So they're terrified that their friends and even their family will abandon them. They're terrified that the people the neighbors that they're having dinner with will, sort of know their name and their controversial opinions and not want to associate with them anymore. And that there really is no solution other than courage. And other than trying to form some kind of infrastructure that provides people with new community when this happens to them. And I'm very conflicted when I talk about this. I do a lot on my podcast, High Noon, this problem of courage and of standing up, even though, and saying these things publicly. And it is my opinion that, for example, as long as Abigail Schreier and Barry Weiss and all of the people who are doing fantastic work and sort of publishing these stories of crazy things that are happening in schools or crazy things that are happening in companies, as long as the majority of people that they're talking to will not put their names on their comments, we're not going to win this battle. That has to start. That just has to stop. It has to stop. And I'm always very conflicted about talking about it this way, because I realize that, in this case, I'm going to use the word privilege. I'm very privileged in this regard. I work for a wonderful organization, the Independent Women's Forum, that not only permits me to speak and won't fire me for my opinions, but actually pays me to share them. So I just do not have the context that a lot of people, and I'm not risking what a lot of people do and would if they step forward. And I'm not going to lie to you, you are risking a lot. It's not a fake threat. But until more people do step forward and say something, the majority is going to keep thinking of themselves as the minority until they actually are the minority. And there's no way around that. There's no, we might be able to tweak here or there. And I think there's a lot we can do in a sort of civic organizing perspective to support these people. I think that we should start having conferences of the canceled. I think these people need friendship and support. IWF just launched this amazing thing called the Independent Women's Network. So that's for women who might be conservative, they might be moderate, they might just have objections to some of what's going on, but we are trying to provide that individualized, actually a real person-to-person network where you can share these things and get support and know that you're not crazy, that you're not alone and you're not crazy. And I think that's so psychologically important to people. I think people in many ways are more willing to risk their livelihoods than they are to risk their lives in sort of a social sense. Yeah. And so I think that is the other huge piece of this that has nothing to do with corporations or with changing legislation necessarily, but it has to do with putting our money where our mouths are and actually supporting people and making sure not only to give them a platform to tell their stories when these things do happen to them, but to provide them with that human support that is necessary when you stand up against a view that everybody else is afraid to stand up against.
I can't agree with you enough, Inez, how important that social aspect of this all is. And no worries. But there's a little bit of dog wrangling going on for those who are listening on the audio only platforms, just so you know, if you hear any dog snoring or anything, just a little bit of dog wrangling going on here, but it's all under control now. In the words of Han Solo, everything is fine here. How are you? Anyway, so this is a very important point, Inez, and I definitely, I will share with people who are listening that I've gone out of my way in my private life to try and, kind of set the standard for this, because I was starting meetup groups in the city where I'm from to draw in people who are interested in the intellectual dark web and sort of heterodox ideas. I was somebody who was basically saying, starting just a few years ago, come all ye canceled, and let's get together and make sure that we can build a community for people who ultimately want to just be their uncensored, sincere selves. And what I can assure people listening is that what you'll find if you take the leap and you start telling the truth and really being brave about it is that, yes, there will undoubtedly be a consequence somewhere in your life, whether it's at work or in your private and social life, but you will end up in a new space socially if you look around a little bit at the people around you and you look at what's going on online. Before there was this sort of intellectual dark web movement, and now there are other movements sort of proliferating, you'll find that there is a group of people who will appreciate you for telling the truth. And ultimately, those are the kinds of people you want to surround yourself with. So I think it's a great point. And I actually I have more optimism on this point actually than the other one, because for me, there was, a moment a few years ago where I basically, I was president of the College Democrats and in the state where I'm from, and I, made a big hullabaloo about freedom of speech on college campuses. I was ostracized. I ended up on a major cable news show that if I say it, people will dox me. But but needless to say, there was a big hullabaloo, and a lot happened to me. But at the end of the day, I ended up a lot better off for it, because of the people I ended up surrounded by after the fact rather than before the leap that I took. So I just want to say from personal experience for listeners that, yes, it is very, very scary, but you can really benefit greatly in terms of the friendships that you'll have and the relationships you'll build if you take that leap.
Yeah. And there's a cost to the alternative. And I was recently speaking with Professor Robbie P. George, who I had on my podcast last week, and he said it really well. I think there's a cost to your soul to not doing this. There really is. There's a cost to your character and your soul, and I understand why it's incredibly difficult. So I'm not downplaying the difficulty of it, but I absolutely agree, Scott. I think there will be people who will support you. You will make new networks and new friendships. They cannot cancel us all. Right. Or they can try, but the canceled will find each other as well. There was this particularly funny New York Times article about the intellectual dark web. And basically the gist of the article was these people who we cancel, they're hanging out and they're having parties in New York. and it was like this very kind of concerned, what are these people doing on the other side? And I think that those kinds of networks have created some of first of all, the most effective pushback to date. And second of all, have given people, the idea or I think that they should give people the idea that there is in fact life after cancellation. And that it's not the absolute worst thing that can happen to you. It's really, really crummy when you're going through it. But there is life on the other side. There's a light again, at the end of the tunnel, and there are new networks and new friendships, and new professional opportunities, and new life on the other side when you do speak your conscience. And there is no better reward than, I think, the feeling of relief that you get from stopping to censor yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Inez. I think that's a perfect place to bring the conversation to a close. I know we were shooting for about an hour. You actually stayed with me a little bit longer, so thanks very much for that. And before we close out, I do want to make sure you have a chance to plug or promote anything you're interested in plugging or promoting. Is there anything you want to give a shout out to, tell people to check out?
Sure. My podcast is High Noon with Inez Stepman. We try to have these conversations, exactly of the type that we've had today, with some really interesting folks, either from the IDW, the liberal left, as well as mainstream conservatism and sort of the new right. So we have a variety of perspectives, although, I'm obviously a conservative and I make no bones about that fact, but we do have some folks from the left, like John McWhorter's been on, Dr. Deborah So. So we've had some folks from what might be termed the IDW or the liberal left as well. And we try to talk about some of these conversations that are really, really hard to have in the broader society and where we're going in terms of the left and the right in this country, as well as issues of feminism, gender, sex, all of that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed starting this pod. So I know there's a million pods, but if you are interested in that type of conversation, you should check it out.
Absolutely. So yeah, anyone listening, if you do have any podcast bandwidth left, do check out High Noon, check out Inez Stepman on Twitter and elsewhere. Obviously, you got to listen to this conversation, so she's got a lot of interesting things to say. I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Inez. This is the Veritas podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, please give a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks so much again for watching and listening. I'm going to see you guys next time on the Veritas podcast.